One of my favorite quotes about technology and invention comes from the science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke, who aptly noted, "Any sufficiently advanced technology will appear as magic." For Europeans in the 14th century, gunpowder was a completely unexpected invention, so much so that they saw it at times as black magic, the work of the devil. In fact, these dark associations probably led to Joan of Arc being burned at the stake in 1431. Along with her ability to inspire the French troops, Joan was a skilled battlefield commander, and more than one witness spoke to her ability to use the newly developed cannon to fight the English. And I quote, "She acted so wisely and clearly in waging war, as if she was a captain who had the experience of 20 or 30 years, and especially in the setting up of the artillery, for in that she held herself magnificently." As a peasant, a commoner, it was probably relatively easy for Joan to have mingled with the craftsmen who made gunpowder and cannon and learned from them the secrets of this new weaponry. At the same time, as a young person outside the military establishment, Joan wasn't committed to fighting battles the same old way. Consequently, if Joan was especially effective and surprising in battle, it would have been quite easy for the English to have branded her a witch, someone in cahoots with the devil who was associated with early gunpowder. Not knowing from whence it came, superstitious medieval folks often called gunpowder the devil's distillate. In this lecture, we won't worry so much about superstition, and we'll look instead at the origins of gunpowder in China, how it came to Europe, and how the Chinese and Europeans came to develop distinctive gunpowder weapons. Now, lest you think that this lecture will be entirely about guns and war, let me assure you that I also talk about how gunpowder changed the politics and the language of Europe. Understand the origin and history of gunpowder, it helps to do the science first. Gunpowder is a blend of sulfur, charcoal, and saltpeter. These substances are finely crushed and mixed together so particles of each are always touching one another. When gunpowder is set on fire, the sulfur burns first because it has a low ignition temperature of 261 degrees centigrade. The sulfur ignites the charcoal, which we have seen in Lecture 2 is a hot, clean fuel. The temperature of the burning mix quickly reaches 335 degrees centigrade, which is the ignition point for saltpeter. Saltpeter is a nitrate salt. Today it's typically potassium nitrate. When saltpeter ignites, the nitrate radical releases extra oxygen, which dramatically speeds up the combustion of both the sulfur and the charcoal. Combustion now produces hot gases which go in every direction, causing a bullet to fly down at high speed in a gun barrel or a bomb to fly apart. Gunpowder's origins are related to magic, not black magic, but rather the white magic of alchemy. Gunpowder was first formulated in the 9th century by Chinese alchemists. Unlike European alchemists who were seeking the philosopher's stone that would transform base substances into gold, their Chinese counterparts, inspired by Taoism, were looking for the elixir of life, hoping that they could come up with something that would allow them to live forever. In this search, Chinese alchemists had identified saltpeter and sulfur as interesting ingredients and seemed to have tried a variety of combinations in search for the magic elixir. Saltpeter is a white powder that is formed by bacteria in topsoil as they feast on decaying organic matter. It often appears as white particles, and in the warm, humid climate of southern China, these particles are leached by water to the surface where they can be harvested. In fact, when Arabs learned of gunpowder from the Chinese, they called saltpeter Chinese snow. Seeking to purify saltpeter and sulfur to create that elixir, Chinese alchemists often heated them together. The very first reference to gunpowder comes from a Chinese text dating from 850 AD, and it was titled Classified Essentials of the Mysterious Tao of the True Origins of Things. And this text warns, "Some have heated together sulfur, realgar, and saltpeter with honey. Smoke and flames result, so that their hands and faces have been burnt, and even the whole house where they were working burned down." Chinese scholars interpreted this interaction of these materials within the philosophical framework of the yin and the yang, noting that, and I quote, "Saltpeter is extremely negative or moonish," that means the yin. "Sulfur is extremely positive and sunny," that is extroversive, and that's the yang. When these two supernatural elements, yin and yang, meet each other in an excessively close space, the resulting explosion will stun every soul and shatter everything around it. Within a century or so, gunpowder was taken up by the army in the Song dynasty and used to make flaming arrows and rockets. The most promising application, though, was to use gunpowder as an accelerant in fire lances, a sort of handheld flamethrower that consisted of a bamboo tube that could shoot 6-foot flames for about 5 minutes or so. Soldiers soon realized that the right mix of saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal could be used not just to ignite the fire lance, but had the explosive power needed to propel bits of metal or potsherds that would injure the enemy. This resulted in what today we'd call a mortar. Over time, the Chinese replaced the bamboo tube in the fire lance with a tube made of bronze or iron. In the 13th century, during the reign of the Mongols, the Chinese military made a further discovery that you could capture all of the force of the explosion of the gunpowder by replacing the bits of metal with a projectile like a ball. By making a close fit between the projectile and the wall of the tube, the force of the explosion of the gunpowder caused the projectile to exit the tube with great force and a high velocity. If you made the tube longer, it became possible to give the projectile a specific trajectory and aim it at a target. Through these steps, the Chinese invented the first guns. The first Chinese gun has been tentatively dated to 1288, and a Chinese bronze hand cannon from 1332 is a foot long and weighs 8 pounds. Hundreds of larger cannon have survived from the 1350s, and they were used to shoot both stone and iron balls. Note that gun and cannon barrels need to be carefully formed. Today they're usually drilled out. Gun barrels in Chinese times were made by rolling a sheet of metal into a tube, but that couldn't necessarily contain the gunpowder blast and frequently blew up in the soldier's face. As a result, guns and cannon were expensive weapons from the start. As the future Ming emperors fought and defeated the Mongols in the late 14th century, both sides used cannon in battle. However, it's not clear to me how extensive cannon were used in Chinese warfare. Much of the fighting involved repelling vast armies of foot soldiers invading from Mongolia, Tibet, Thailand, and Vietnam, and the Chinese found it more expedient to arm their own soldiers with lots of fire lances and lots of rocket-propelled bombs. Because they were dealing with large hordes of attackers, rockets and fire lances proved to be very effective weapons. They were light, cheap, and could be launched against the horde so as to create both injury and confusion. Now let's turn and talk about guns and gunpowder in Europe. Historians are still debating how information about gunpowder got to Europe in the 13th century. It may have been one of several inventions that simply traveled along with travelers and traders along the Silk Road. Alternatively, Europeans learned about it as they fought with the Mongols who invaded parts of Russia and Eastern Europe in the early 13th century. Equally, after they overthrew the Song emperors, the Mongols regarded the Chinese as worthless and turned to Arabs and Europeans to be minor officials and to help rule their state. Hence, the Mongols readily shared ideas with both Arabs and Europeans. The earliest reference to gunpowder in Europe dates to 1267, in which the English natural philosopher Roger Bacon wrote to the Pope about having seen what appears to have been a small firecracker. And Bacon observes, and I quote, "By the flash and combustion of fires and by the horror of the sounds, wonders can be wrought and at any distance that we wish, so that a man can hardly protect himself or endure it." As in China, it took about 50 years for news of gunpowder to move in Europe from the academic realm to military practice. By the 1330s, military commanders were adding cannon and gunpowder to their arsenals throughout Europe. And in the Battle of Crécy in 1346, Edward III of England used cannon against the French, not so much to mow down the French knights, for that he relied on his longbow archers, as to terrorize the French with the thunderous sounds of his cannon and the fire that spewed from their barrels. Early on, collecting enough saltpeter was a serious challenge in Europe, as the climate was not sufficiently hot and humid for the sort of rapid natural production that we saw in China. While some gunpowder makers scoured barnyards, privies, and caves looking for the telltale white droppings, others experimented with recreating natural conditions. One recipe from 1561 recommended filling a pit with old plaster, horse dung, human feces, and urine. And I quote about the urine, namely the urine of those persons which drink either wine or strong beer. Although they didn't know it at the time, the metabolism of alcohol in urine produces ammonium, a favorite food of nitrate bacteria. Because the major military challenges in Europe were either to break down the walls of castles or the walls of town, or to sink naval ships, as opposed to stopping the invading hordes, Europeans used gunpowder mostly in the form of cannon. But to do so, they had to fashion stronger and larger cannons than those that had been found and used in China. Casting large pieces like cannon is difficult and expensive because you have to pour the molten metal carefully to avoid creating any big air bubbles. Those are known as rat holes, and the rat holes can weaken a casting once it cools. It's for this reason that the art of casting came to be known as being more dependent on fortune than ability. To avoid casting and its related problems, cannon makers tried borrowing techniques from coopers or barrel makers. Cannon makers would place long wrought iron rods around a wooden core, heat them, and then hammer them together. They would then fill any cracks with white lead and add white-hot rings of iron, which would shrink when they cooled and hold everything together once the wooden core was pulled out. Now you can see why we talk about cannons and guns as having a barrel. Known as bombards, these early cannon took an enormously long time to load and fire. At the siege of Metz in 1437, for example, officers were astounded when a master gunner managed to fire 3 rounds in one day from a very large bombard. One of the challenges confronting gunners was that gunpowder often got damp and spoiled quickly. To overcome this problem, powder makers learned to add a small amount of liquid to the 3 basic ingredients before grinding them together in a mortar and pestle. Again, human urine was the preferred liquid to be added, and it was thought that the urine of imbibing bishops made especially good gunpowder. Powder makers then shaped the resulting paste, known as mill cake, into corns or granules, and then it was allowed to dry. They most likely called the granules corn since they looked like wheat grain, and corn is the general term used in Europe to refer to grain crops. Not only did corned powder work better or keep better, but because it had a reduced surface area, it was less prone to absorb moisture. And gunners also found that it was more powerful and easier to load into guns. Whereas a cannon might have needed 34 pounds to shoot a 47-pound stone ball, it took only 18 pounds of the new corn powder to fire the same ball the same distance. The main advantage of corning is that all the granules ignite when the gunpowder is lit, and so more hot gas is created more quickly. Without corning, much of the powder was often wasted since it blew out of the barrel before it burned. By the way, the same process of granulation is still used today by the pharmaceutical industry to ensure that every tablet contains the same proportion of active ingredients. As with many technologies, as one component improves, so inventors and artisans need to modify other components. In other words, the cannon became a system of interconnected components. Better powder provoked a need for stronger cannon, and gun makers studied the production of bronze church bells, since like cannon barrels, bells have to be cast around a hollow core. Around this time, it also became possible to cast iron to make cannon, thanks to the development of the blast furnace. Up to the early modern era, Europeans could not build a fire hot enough to melt iron. And as we'll see in Lecture 13, cast iron only became widely available when ironmasters learned to pump a blast of air into a furnace loaded with iron ore and charcoal. As gun makers became more proficient at casting cannon barrel, they learned how much metal they needed in the different parts of the cannon. While it was good to have as much as 8 inches of iron at the breech, the back of the barrel, the pressures of the explosion of the gunpowder decreased even a few inches forward so that by that point you could get away with only 2 or 3 inches of thickness. Gunmakers also realized that if you made the barrel longer relative to the bore, that's the inside diameter, the gunpowder had more time to burn behind the ball, generate more gases, and thus speed up the exit velocity of the ball. Finally, about 1450, Dutch gunmakers added lugs to either side of the cannon barrel so the gun could be swiveled up and down as well as mounted on wheels and could be hauled to the battlefield by horses. As both corned powder and cannon barrels improved, so it became desirable to have denser ammunition. The cannonballs were stone initially, and those were expensive to carve, and they tended to shatter when they hit the castle walls. To take advantage of the other improvements in the system, artillery officers sought out iron balls that could be cast more cheaply. Because they could be cast more precisely, iron cannonballs could be made so that there was a small clearance between the ball and the bore of the gun, meaning that the ball captured more of the power of the explosion. This overall system, corned powder, iron cannon, iron cannonballs, defined European artillery for the next 300 years, from 1600 to 1900, and only really changed at the end of the 19th century with new chemical explosives like TNT. To take full advantage of this emergent system, some Army officers took up the study of trigonometry in order to calculate how high the gun barrel needed to be in order to reach a target at a certain distance. In France, the king established in the 17th century an artillery corps and then an artillery school for training these officers. Within a few decades, the king added new corps and new schools, leading to the creation of an engineering corps in the Army and the first engineering school, the École des Ponts et Chaussées, the School for Bridges and Roads. This was the start of modern engineering education, and it's why many of the civil engineers in the American federal government, particularly those that look after infrastructure, belong to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. It's based on a French model. Because gunpowder and cannon were expensive, only kings could afford them, and they used them to defeat rebellious town people and powerful dukes. As a result, gunpowder contributed to the emergence of strong monarchies in the 1600s and 1700s. In addition, corned gunpowder introduced the possibility of making refined handguns and muskets that could be used by individual soldiers. The earliest shoulder guns, known in the German as Hakenbusch, meaning guns with a hook, and that word was rendered into English as arquebuses, they were made in Germany in the 14th century, and these guns needed 2 men to operate them and were so heavy that they had to be fired from a stand. Muskets were initially a larger version of the arquebus and could weigh up to 25 pounds. Consequently, when you think of the Three Musketeers, an elite corps in the French Army, you should envision them as the equivalent of today's Green Berets or Navy SEALs. The phrase lock, stock, and barrel refers to having all parts of a handgun. So let's look briefly at the evolution of each of these components. The stock was the first part to form. It began as a wooden stick inserted into a socket at the back end of the barrel, which the soldier could then grip. Over time, the stock evolved into a wooden piece that allowed the soldier to hold the gun up to his shoulder so that he could absorb the recoil with his whole torso as opposed to simply his arms. The lock was probably the most complicated piece to develop, as it had to deliver the ignition charge to the gunpowder. Early soldiers often wished that they had 3 hands, 2 to hold the gun and a 3rd to apply the match to the charge. The first step came in the form of a small hook attached to a lever. On the hook was placed a smoldering wick, and when the soldier pulled on the other end of the lever, the beginnings of a trigger, the wick swung down and ignited the gunpowder through a touch hole in the barrel. Known as a matchlock, this was the cutting edge of handguns from the middle of the 1400s into the early 1500s. The mechanism was called a lock because the next nearest everyday thing that it resembled were the early locks found on doors. Because guns were reordering the political and military world of the Renaissance, many of the leading thinkers and artists devoted themselves to improving weapons in order to secure or maintain the support of powerful patrons. Among the great minds that studied weapons was Leonardo da Vinci, and as early as 1500, he sketched an alternative to the matchlock. Instead of dealing with the smoldering wick, Leonardo developed a wheel lock. Much like a modern cigarette lighter, the device consisted of a steel wheel which, when rotated, struck a flint, giving off sparks that went through the touch hole. German gun makers enthusiastically adopted the wheel lock and used it initially to make hunting guns for the nobility, since the wheel lock was too delicate and too expensive to be placed in the hands of ordinary soldiers. Eventually, in the 18th century, the wheel lock on shoulder guns was replaced by the flint lock, in which a trigger controlled a hammer-like lever that had a flint mounted on it, and that flint struck a steel piece that was not mounted next to the touch hole. Wheel locks, though, gave rise to the first pistols, favored by cavalrymen since they could then ride and shoot at the same time. Wheel lock pistols were also the preferred weapon of highway robbers, leading to laws in many places in the 16th century that limited who could own pistols. Finally, let's talk about the barrel. You may have noticed that I've been using the word gun here and not rifle. That's because a rifle is a specific kind of shoulder weapon with a barrel in which spiral grooves are machined on the inside wall. The grooves impart a spin to the projectile as it travels down the barrel, with the result that the projectile travels outside the gun on a straighter trajectory. Consequently, rifles were much more accurate than a smoothbore musket. As I understand it, though, you have to be very careful with a front-end loading rifle, lest you spoil the grooves as you load your charge and rifle ball and ram it home. Because it took longer to load rifles than muskets, European armies didn't take up rifles until well into the 19th century. Further, it was not really until American gunsmiths began turning out hunting rifles for pioneers, first by hand and then by machine, it became feasible to produce enough rifles for an army. As you might expect, it required highly skilled metal workers in the Renaissance to make guns. It was difficult to make barrels that would not explode, and great craftsmanship was needed to assemble the precision trigger mechanism. As a result, gun making was restricted to a handful of European cities possessing a sufficiently large number of skilled artisans. Venice was one such city, and its armament factory in the nearby town of Brescia became famous for the matchlock muskets it provided to the armies of Europe. Gunpowder, cannon, and handguns changed not only the face of warfare in Europe, but the political and social structure as well. These weapons were extremely effective, but they were also very expensive. It was much more costly to equip an army of musketmen than one of archers. The use of cannon inflicted enormous damage on buildings, and it made it necessary to build elaborate fortifications to protect castles and towns. Such elaborate fortifications that were capable of withstanding heavy cannon fire were much more expensive than your average castle, and those new fortifications could only be built by kings. For all these reasons, it was now beyond the means of powerful nobles or aristocrats to support private armies. By the end of the 16th century, war had become the reserve of kings and other rulers who were able to raise taxes to pay for soldiers and armament. And so gunpowder and weapons played an important role in the appearance of the modern national state as we know it. As we have seen, gunpowder and guns are truly Chinese inventions, and that they both appeared there centuries before they were used in Europe. But because they were dealing with large hordes of land armies, the Chinese put much more effort into developing fire lances and rockets to repel those hordes. In contrast, Europeans took a greater interest in cannon because those could be used to break down fortifications and thus defeat troublesome counts holed up in castles or unruly townspeople hiding behind the walls. As we saw in Lecture 10 on paper and printing, new inventions can have dramatically different trajectories east and west. You could argue that gunpowder and fire lances were effectively deployed by the Chinese to maintain a degree of homogeneity in their culture, to keep out the invaders, while gunpowder in Europe fed into the forces that were separating people into different nation states. Here again we see how different circumstances prompted groups to take the same invention, gunpowder, and use it to create very different weapons. As with so many great inventions, there is no one best way to develop a new technology. It depends on the political and social circumstances. It's people, not technology, that shape the course of history.